We are very fortunate today to have Gordon Brown here with us to give a keynote address, and he will be both introduced by Robert Skidelsky and then joined by Robert for a Q&A thereafter. And I understand somewhere in our midst are copies of Gordon's new book, Beyond the Crash, which I've read, and I'd encourage you to read and pick up while you're here. At any rate, advisory board member, tremendous biographer, Lord Robert Skidelsky.
Gordon Brown requires even less introduction than most eminent speakers on such an occasion. He was British Prime Minister from 2007 to 10, and before then Chancellor of the Exchequer for 10 years. So he's superbly well qualified to speak of matters which are the subject of what I hope will come to be known as the second Bretton Woods Conference. However, there is something else which makes him a particularly welcome guest on this occasion. If one asks the question, why did the Great Recession of 2008-9 not become the Second Great Depression? The answer, I think, lies in the much more skillful international coordination of the response, which the contraction for the first 5 months lasted exactly as long as the contraction at the time of the Great Depression, but after that it bottomed out and we didn't go on going down. And three elements in that response seem crucial. The coordinated reduction of nominal interest rates right at the beginning, the coordinated recapitalization of the European and American banking system in October 2008, and the third was the coordinated $1 trillion stimulus package agreed by the G20 in April 2009. The effect of these measures in preventing an actual deflation of world prices and a consequent rise in real interest rates was crucial in bringing the contraction to an end. When the economic crisis erupted in 2008-2009, Gordon Brown was the right man in the right place at the right time. He led the international recovery effort. Mr. Wolfensohn, the president of the World Bank, described the April 2009 meeting of the G20 as the thing that broke the back of the slump, a meeting chaired by Gordon in London. And what we want to hear from Gordon this afternoon is how to break the back of the next slump.
Can I say, first of all, what a real pleasure and privilege it is to be here in Bretton Woods, to be here under the auspices of this new institute, to be here with George Soros, who I admire not simply for his business acumen and his philanthropy, but for his new thinking about the economy and his theory of reflexivity, which has been very useful, I think, in trying to understand the events of the crash. And I'm very grateful to have had such a kind and generous introduction from Robert Skidelsky, who, as everybody here knows, is the great biographer of Keynes, and who I would describe in the time that I've known him as my mentor and sometimes also my tormentor. Keynes had a pretty skeptical view of politicians generally. He described politics as the survival of the unfittest. When he published his pamphlet, How We Can Conquer Unemployment, in 1929, which was the start of the new thinking that led to the general theory, he sent a copy to the Treasury, which I happened to have been the head of for some years. And when I arrived at the Treasury in 1997, I went into the Treasury library and I saw this copy of Keynes' How We Can Conquer Unemployment, and marked inside on it by the Treasury had been these three words only: inflation, extravagance, bankruptcy. And that is how Keynes was seen by the Treasury at the time. Keynes didn't think much of politicians. He didn't think much of lawyers, as some of you may have read. I was reading this morning as I came up the final speech that Keynes made at Bretton Woods, perhaps not in this room, but in one of the great rooms here. And he was summing up and giving his vote of thanks to people who had made a huge difference. And he said that he had gone to the US Treasury in 1941 and met the US Treasury Secretary Morgenthau. And as he walked into the Treasury, they said to him, Lord Keynes, you're on your own. And he said, yes. He said, haven't you brought your lawyer? And Keynes said, no. And the guy said, who does your thinking for you? It's why Keynes said that he thought there were too many lawyers in America, and he thought that the Mayflower boat, which first brought the Pilgrims across from America to Britain, had been filled completely of lawyers, the only people who had come to emigrate to the country. I've had a period of reflection, you might say, since the general election in Britain. Involuntary reflection, I may say, enforced reflection. And I was thinking back to the lessons that I've learned and what I want to talk about today and how they apply to the next stage of global economics. I started off as a finance minister in 1997, and I went to my first meeting of the G8 in July 1997. By the time I arrived, there was only 7 of the original invitees there because the French minister had resigned. And a year later, when I was at the next set of G8 summer meetings, by that time, we'd lost the German minister and we'd lost the Russian minister. A few months later, we lost the Japanese minister, so there was only 4 of the original 8 there. And within 2 years, when Bob Rubin retired and Larry Summers took over, he was here last night as Treasury Secretary, Paul Martin and I were the longest-serving finance ministers in the G8 after only 2 years in the job. And so I can reflect on the transience of politics and on the difficulties that politicians face when trying to manage very difficult economic questions. Of one, it was said as he left, they repeated the words of Shelley, who was talking about his mother-in-law. They said he had lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And I hope that is not your conclusion about me today. I want to take you through 3 examples or illustrations of events that happened during the financial crisis, and then to draw some conclusions that I think are interesting about the way the world's going, and make some observations about the policies I think that need to be followed in the future. In 2007, long before the financial crisis reached its height, we did realize that there were things going wrong in the financial economy. In 1998, after the Asian financial crisis, I'd actually suggested that we needed a system of global financial supervision, and we should set up an early warning system for the world economy, because I suspected that the Asian financial problems would recur in one way or another in the rest of the world, if not in exactly the same way. And in 2007, we ran a simulation exercise, what you might call a war game, which involved the American administration. It involved Hank Poulsen as the Treasury Secretary, involved Ben Bernanke as the governor of the central bank, involved the regulatory agencies in the United States of America, involved Mervyn King, our governor of the Bank of England, then the then chairman of the Financial Service Authority. So everybody was part of this, and we were looking at this instance. What would we do if an institution like a building society or bank collapsed, and what then would be the reaction? Was it a systemic question? Was it an issue that would have to be dealt with by government intervention? Was it possible to say that this was a moral hazard too far and that we should do nothing? And we looked at this institution, not too dissimilar to one of the problems that came up later, and looked at what we had to do. And gradually, people who had started with the view that we shouldn't intervene came to the conclusion that you would have to do something if something happened to an institution that may not seem systemically important, but actually would have a huge effect on the rest of the economy. But as I look back on that, I now realize that we had not, because I know the institutions that then went down, understood at all the wholly entangled nature of the economy, the links between the different financial institutions, the fact that that institution was operating in such a way that you needed to consult with far wider regulatory authorities than just America and Britain. We hadn't understood the global nature of financial entanglements. And then I take you through to the next meeting I just want you to recall. There was a first meeting ever of the Euro group with the heads of government. Previously, only finance ministers had met. But in 2008, in October, the crisis was getting so great, Lehman Brothers had collapsed. We had decided as Britain to recapitalize our banks. We were hoping that other countries would follow. And we came to a meeting of the Eurogroup with all the leaders, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, with the Jean-Claude Trichet there. And Europe was coming together to decide what its reaction to was the financial crisis. And again, there are lessons to learn from what happened. Because at that meeting, I'll be honest, and I think people will confirm this, there was no sense that this crisis was anything other than an Anglo-Saxon crisis at that time. Indeed, the general mood was that America and Britain were to blame for what had happened, and the Europeans had been smart enough to keep themselves out of the crisis. And there was a sense that if you could ride through the events by giving some support to individual banks who were in difficulty, then you could get through it without major restructuring. And I was there, invited uniquely actually, because we are, as you probably know, not a member of the Euro, so I was rather surprised to be invited. And I was pointing out, but look, the subprime, half of that has arrived in Europe. So European institutions were some of the biggest buyers of subprime securities. And in fact, Ben Bernanke has just done a paper in the last few weeks showing the sheer scale of the flows and how they were financed with short-term funds by purchases of German, French, British, Irish banks and so on. And then I said, look, Europe has got banks that are more highly leveraged than America. Of course, business depends more on European banking than even America does on American business on American banking. And it was only over time that people came to see that this was indeed a global financial crisis. They knew that there were global repercussions from what was happening as a result of Lehman's, but they did not understand it was a crisis also in the European banking system. And they did not understand, and all of us didn't understand initially, just how interconnected the European banking system was with the rest of the world. Now I want to come to one other instance, and then I want to draw another conclusion. The October 2010 meeting of, November 2010 meeting of the G20 in Seoul. In 2009, April 2009, we decided as leaders that we would not only take action, the $1 trillion stimulus and the support for the World Bank and the IMF and trade credits and everything else, in support of the interest rate policies being pursued by central banks as well, but we also decided we would go for what we called a global growth pact, that we would try to make sure that the economy could grow substantially out of recession. And we'd not just stop the recession becoming a depression, but we try to grow. So we brought together the IMF and other institutions in support of drawing up what was called MAP, a global growth pact. And in September 2009 at Pittsburgh, we decided that there would be a global growth pact. The IMF would report to us on what coordinated action could achieve. Once they reported back, the politicians would make a decision about the next steps, which could have included a wide range of different actions, whether on fiscal policy, on trade policy, or in other areas of regulation and supervision. Now, it came to the autumn of 2010. I was no longer in government at the time. But it's fascinating to think and look back on what actually happened. Because the South Koreans tried, and I think quite imaginatively, to find a way out of the exchange rate argument between America and China, which was preventing any agreement on a global growth pact. So the South Koreans proposed privately to the Americans and to the Chinese that they would go for a ceiling for surpluses and deficits, and that would be one means by which they could rebalance the world economy. And China was interested in this, and so too was America. It was a way out for China from the currency debacle, but it was also a way out for America to see that progress was being made in relation to China and its trade surpluses. What happened then was Tim Geithner made a speech arguing the case for a 4% surplus and that would be part of the policy of the G20. The Chinese misunderstood this and felt that this was actually a private discussion now becoming public. The Germans and Japanese realized that they too were affected by this because it affected their current account and their deficits and surpluses, and the whole attempt to get an agreement that went beyond the argument on the exchange rate failed. And so we have ended up with a situation where you cannot mention growth pact and exchange rate in the same communique, far less the same paragraph or the same sentence. So what started off as a major attempt at international cooperation, where there would be a global growth pact that would involve all the major economies of the world, has ended so far in an argument about terminology and how you define what is essential elements of building an agreement about growth and about the future of the economy. Now, my thesis today is we have global problems that in this generation we now understand completely cannot be solved by one country alone or by national action on their own. These are global problems, whether they be financial stability, growth itself, trade with the trade talks, environment and climate change, and you could go on to security and other issues. They cannot now be addressed and resolved by one country on their own. They can only be resolved by global coordinated action. But we are now retreating into national shells, given that the immediate crisis is over. And whether it's in the trade talks, where we have the danger of the first failed trade agreement since 1948, or whether it's in financial stability, which I'll come to in a minute, where we seem to have different countries competing to lower the capital ratios which they will demand of their banking system, or whether it be in growth, where we've had this breakdown as a result of a misunderstanding that has led to a failure to get an agreement. And instead of enhancing global cooperation and building better institutions for the future, we are now in danger of seeing global cooperation diminish and what I call minilateralism rather than multilateralism becoming the order of the day. Now, just think how important this is. I think people will look back on these last 20 years as far more significant than even the years that started the Industrial Revolution. Because what happened in the last 20 years was not simply the rise of China, and not simply Asia becoming more prominent, and not simply the massive flows of capital that we know have existed at a far higher level than before. What happened in the last 20 years was a fundamental restructuring of the world economy. So you come to 2010, and for the first time, virtually for nearly 200 years, America and Europe, that's the United States of America and the 27 members of the European Union, for the first time are being out-produced and out-manufactured and out-exported and also, interestingly, out-invested by the rest of the world. So everything that we have taken for granted for almost 2 centuries, American and European dominance, to the point at which most of the world's manufacturing goods, most of the world's exports, most of the world's investment was done in these countries, is no longer a fact. And billions of people have now entered the industrial economy, and it was inevitable that 2 continents that represented only just over 10% of the world's population could never hold that majority, far less a near monopoly forever. But we're about to witness a second change, in my view, that is equally as powerful and makes the case for global cooperation even more urgent. Because in the same way that we added 2 billion producers to the world economy over the last 20 years, we are about to add 2 billion consumers. People who will aspire to middle-class incomes, people who will aspire to buying middle-class products and services, a huge growth of the middle class, particularly in Asia, but in the other BRIC countries, which is going to transform the relationships between consumer and producer across the world, and is probably the means by which the world economy will be eventually rebalanced. And think of it this way. America has been the largest consumer market for years now, for decades. By 2020 to 2025, you can choose your year whether you're an optimist or a pessimist or however you describe it in writing about these things. But at some point in that 5-year period, Asia will become responsible for about 40% of consumer spending in the world. America will be 20%. Germany will be 4%. Britain will be 3%, France, Italy, less than 3%. Europe will be in total only 18% or something like that. So what you're seeing is this vast change in the ability to consume that is bound to affect how industries and how sectors and how economies are going to behave in the future. And you might think automatically that this means the decline of the West. It is not, in my view, inevitable at all. It depends how Europe and America react to what is a vast set of changes happening in the global economy before our eyes. And it makes you think. We talk about the new normality as if we are returning to some sort of normalcy, even though it's a different kind of normality. I think we're an economy, a world economy, still undergoing the biggest transition in the world's economic history. And I don't think that transition is complete, even when you add the 2 billion consumers of Asia, which will change the patterns of industry, exports and development for the future. It also means if America is half the size of the Asian consumer market, trade, free trade, is in the interests of America and in the interests of Europe, who will want to get their exports sold into the fastest growing consumer market in the world. And it changes your views about who benefits from protectionism and who benefits from trade in the future. In other words, it challenges a whole series of ideas that we've held before about how the economy is likely to develop in the future. And I just want to make 5 points and then answer any questions about what I think the policy conclusions that you might draw from this are. First of all, it's clear to me that America and Europe will have to reinvent themselves. That we will have to be, in America and Europe, the producers of the high quality, the value added, the technology driven, the sophisticated products and services that depend on intellectual capital and on knowledge, creativity and talent. And that seems to me, if you believe, as I do therefore, that we're in a period of transition and that we're not in a new normality yet, then it makes you think about policies that are being pursued. Because if that is your aim, to be successful in this economy of the future, then you've got to invest in technology, you've got to invest in science, you've got to invest in education. And so many of the arguments that are being put about the necessity for reductions in spending in our economy may be right in the context of deficit reduction policies and the very short term, but if you take the long term, I don't think America and Europe can afford to find themselves ill-equipped for the challenges of the future. And equally, these challenges of the future, and I think Michael Spence is speaking later, and he's done a book on this, it means that growth will come in the export sectors, but not massive job creation, and you're going to have to look at the problem of youth unemployment and the problem of unemployment in economies in America and Europe. So it makes us think again about the economic policies we're pursuing. If I'm right, we've got to equip ourselves for this new economy that is developing, and we're merely in the transition to it, then it seems to me that policies about capital investment have got to be reconsidered even now. And I asked Dr. Blanchard at the IMF, they have done a model about a growth pact between different continents. And they have shown that if we had greater coordination, there would be 3% higher growth by 2014, probably about 25 to 50 million more jobs created as a result of coordinated policies. And I asked him if he could also look at whether, if we increased public investment in these vital areas of education, science, and technology, whether you could, because of the stimulus provided in the way it was being provided, avoid increasing the deficit while at the same time increasing growth by the capital investments programs. And he said a 1.2% increase in the amount of GDP going to capital investment in America, 1% increase in Europe, 0.5% in Japan, it will be far more now as a result of the tsunami, would actually lead to 0.8% higher growth in America, 0.6% in Europe, 0.5% in Japan, without the deficit being increased. And I do think that is an important part of the argument that we've now got to address. The second issue is then what happens to Asia and what our policy has got to be there. And it seems to me we have been pursuing, we've pursued China into a cul-de-sac over exchange rates. Because whatever your view on exchange rates, that has become such a politicized issue that to get agreement on that specifically is very, very difficult. But what is the problem that China really causes us? The problem that China causes us is exactly the problem that China defines itself as their own problem, that they've got too little consumer spending. They've taken too few people out of poverty while taking many already. They've taken too few against their targets. And at the same time, they've not got a big enough middle class. So China's problem internally that they worry about is social cohesion as a result of the failure of expectations to be met amongst their growing urban and rural populations. And at the same time, the problem that we've got is that China is not consuming enough and open enough to imports of our goods. So it seems to me there is scope for a global growth agreement involving China and the West. In India, it's a different problem because India has got a pretty high rate of consumption. There is growth, but not equity. And at the same time, in India, they've got to deal with opening up markets, and that would probably help reduce poverty as well. But if China and much of the rest of Asia, it is increasing consumption, and we ought to build into our discussions with the Chinese, what can we do to help you achieve your goal, which is to increase consumer spending for the mass of your population, to take more people out of poverty, to raise the middle class in numbers, and that actually fits in with a policy as long as there's an opening up of markets between Europe, America, and China. Now, my third point is about financial stability. I do believe that we're going back to a race to the bottom. And when I look at the debate now on capital ratios related to banks, since the tragedies of 2008-9, and I know Adair Turner is going to speak on this later, and I think Andy Holding's here from the Bank of England as well, and he has got some very, very fascinating statistics that he's published recently. I believe we're in a real problem here, that it's no longer possible to imagine that we're going to get a great global agreement on financial standards. And what's going to happen is that the good are going to be undercut by the bad, and the bad undercut by the worst. And if we allow that situation to develop in the way that it would, we are just sowing the seeds of the next financial crisis. And I would just emphasize two things. There should be an international agreement on capital ratios. Otherwise, you will simply have banks threatening to move from one country to another. And secondly, we should take up the proposal in the Dodd-Franks bill that is now legislation for a financial reporting office. They want, in America, to track the flow of finance. And they want to track it in America. And obviously, if that had been done, some of the problems that, for example, in subprime would have been known far earlier on. But we need to do that at a global level, and that means the IMF or the Global Stability Forum, the Global Financial Stability Forum, involved in doing so. We have got to demand that we go back to the original proposition of 2009, that we don't just set national and regional standards and requirements. They have got to be global, otherwise we will have a race to the bottom. Now, my final 2 points are one about the rest of the world and Africa, and the Middle East and North Africa in particular. Anything that I look at suggests to me that the biggest force at work in the next 10 years is the rise of the middle class in Asia. But that Africa, despite high levels of growth in individual countries, is likely to continue to lose out. And I say that not because there hasn't been great progress, and not because Africa's not $1 trillion economy now, $1.5 trillion, and sub-Saharan African is $1 trillion, not because there's not 6 or 7% growth rates in some countries. But if you look at the basic problem, Africa is 15% of the world's population. It's going to be 20% within a few years' time. It's going to have 25% of the young people of the world. And if I'm right, it's got about 2% of the world's investment. It's got about 1% of the world's wealth. It's got about 1% of the world's manufacturing. It is not, without more dramatic change, it is difficult to see Africa catching up, or many countries in Africa catching up for years. And we have also this huge problem of youth unemployment, because we've got the birth rate being high. We've got in Egypt, if you remember the figures you've seen on the television, 35% youth unemployment. In Tunisia, 30% youth unemployment. Algeria, massive youth unemployment. Saudi Arabia, massive youth unemployment. And we don't have economies that are capable of meeting the aspirations of young people. And I do say that in 2 years' time, and maybe earlier, even if you've changed regime in these countries, as has been happening, if you haven't dealt with the basic discontents of young people who have not got opportunities, you will find political problems recurring. And I don't believe, from what I've seen, that Egypt on its own, without international support, or Algeria or Tunisia or some of the other countries in the region, without at least an agreement within the region or with the rest of the world, can solve their problems on their own. Now, I would say that we have to think of, first of all, an Africa infrastructure fund, and trying to see whether the incentives for people to invest in Africa can match the incentives that are there for people to massively flow capital into Asia, the risk perhaps of inflation and overheating. We've got to do something about education so that these young people have not just the skills, but then industries can base their future around knowing that these skills are available in the area with the largest number of young people in the world. And we've got to have a strategy for the developing countries, because the gap between rich and poor is going to continue to grow if we do nothing about it. My final point is this. It's about international institutions. If I'm right that we're now in an age where global problems need global solutions, then we've got to face up to the problem of how our international institutions were run. The institutions that Keynes and others created from here in 1944 were institutions for their time. They were dealing with national sheltered economies. They were dealing with local flows of capital, not global flows of capital. They were dealing with markets that were local and national and not global as they are today. And therefore, the institutions were constructed in a particular way to deal with these problems. To be brief about it, I believe the IMF should be conceived more as an independent central bank. I believe that its responsibilities should be about transparency and surveillance and making sure that people have the knowledge of what's happening in the world economy, and they report on how countries and continents are performing. I believe that it should be seen as less as Keynes said at the time, less not as a political committee, but as something independent of vested interests that can actually pressure it. I believe the World Bank should be more involved in the environment and the financing of development as alongside the environment. I believe that the G20 will have to adopt a constituency system, because you can't have 20 countries only represented. I mean, finance ministers were not that bright, because there were 26 people when they called it the G20. But you've got to represent the 190 countries in one way or another, and you can do it best through a constituency system like exists at the IMF. You've got to have an organization dealing with environmental problems. So we've got to have a serious plan to reconstruct the international institutions for the times that we're in, and not for the past times that have gone. And we've got to bear in mind that this is a world economy in transition, not a world economy that's reached a new place of normalcy, which is unlikely to change for many, many years ahead. Now, that to me is a big agenda for the international community. And the final point I would make is this. It's very easy to whip up nationalist sentiment. It's very easy to define a problem as simply a problem in one country. It really is interesting how the world is now describing what has been a global crisis as the Greek problem, the Irish problem, the Portuguese problem, everybody's whatever. Everybody's got a problem that is specific to the national economies. And each of them do have very special features, and some completely unacceptable features in the problems that they present to the world. But we mustn't forget that this is and has been a global financial crisis. It arises from the opening up of global flows of capital and the global sourcing of goods. It arises from our failure to manage the world economy through proper global financial supervision and a recognition that we need to build in an early warning system for ourselves. And it continues because we haven't been able at an international level to agree on how we can manage and develop growth for the future. We are a world economy where parts of it are running well below their capacity, with the result that one of the objectives that Keynes had in mind, that you can have full employment, seems further away than ever. It is not a tenable situation given particularly what I describe in Africa, North Africa, and in the Middle East, with young people denied the basic opportunity to work. And this is an agenda for our times. When Tennyson was writing his poetry in the 19th century, and he coined the great phrase that is now the Olympic motto in Britain, to seek, to strive, to fight, and not to yield. In 1885, he wrote a poem, Locksley Hall, 60 Years On, and he said, Cosmos chaos, or chaos cosmos? He said, where would it all end? And Gladstone was Prime Minister at the time, and he read this poem from Tennyson, who was a friend of his, and he said, look, and he wrote an article for one of the literary magazines, which is very unusual for a Prime Minister to even contemplate doing. And he wrote this article, and he replied to Tennyson, and he said, look, you wrote the poem Locksley Hall, just called Locksley Hall, 60 years ago. And now you've written a poem, Locksley Hall 60 years on. But just remember what you said in that poem 60 years before. When you said that there should be a parliament of man, which is the phrase that people use now when writing of the United Nations. And that poem went, dipped into the future as far as I could see. And I saw a vision of the world and the wonder that could be. And that was Gladstone's reply to the pessimism of Tennyson. I believe we can be very optimistic about the future of the world, but we can only be optimistic in circumstances where we use this great intellectual strength that is represented here today, and also the intellectual and social and moral force of people around the world in building an economy which is fair, sustainable, and which delivers the objectives of economic policy, which include that everyone should have the opportunity for employment and for prosperity. I think it's a great challenge for the economics community, but I'm absolutely sure that the people sitting here can meet that challenge. Thank you very much. Just quick questions, statements and questions.
Statements and questions. Yeah. One second. We've got 20 minutes for a question and answer session, and after that, a wonderful dip into the future. Please go ahead. I think Gordon will take most of the questions and answers himself. If I see anyone that you may have missed, I'll draw your attention to it.
And if they're difficult, I'll refer them to you.
Okay. Okay. I'm sure you won't need to. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that amazing tour de force. I'm Steve Clemens with the New America Foundation in Washington. I wonder if you might go back to the, as you said, the early 2007 dynamic where some of your European partners looked at this as an Anglo-Saxon crisis at the beginning. And as I understand it from some of the folks that have been discussing here, is that in the recent behavior inside Europe, private capital is moving out, and that nearly every bond issue right now essentially has government ownership or sovereign wealth funds, that you have essentially state capitalism emerging as the dominant ethic, if you will, from those that have been moving this after the crisis in a way that is really quite antithetical to what I think you were trying to do. So I'd be interested in a little bit more commentary on how you see things today inside the European, really whether it's a theological debate or an ideological debate, they're moving in a course that I think was quite different than what you were trying to engineer.
Yeah, I've got to be straightforward at the beginning of a discussion on the euro. I recommended that Britain not join the euro. And I did so because I felt that to fix your interest rate and to have a single currency without other flexibilities being agreed would make it impossible for countries to converge without massive unemployment or certainly very difficult changes having to be made. On the other hand, having looked at the euro, I think politically it's very important that we make sure it doesn't collapse, because it would not only be a huge setback for international cooperation, it would also be a major disruption of Europe, and it's very difficult to imagine what would happen in circumstances where Germany adopted its own exchange rate and others were starting afresh with new exchange rates. So what's the problem they've got to solve if they're going to make this work? And I think that's the issue. And the problem they've got to solve is that there are three separate problems in Europe. One is, of course, the deficits. Overall, the European deficit's about 5.5% of, at the moment, of European GDP, but individual countries have huge deficits, and they've got to take action to deal with them at some point. But the second issue is banks, and I personally believe that there is still a huge problem in the failure to recapitalize many of our European banks. And I believe it's easy to define the European problem as simply the problem of the periphery. That's Greece and Ireland and Spain and Portugal being responsible for either profligacy or allowing their banks to get out of control. But actually, there's a problem at the core of Europe, and that is the liabilities that banks have. First of all, because they bought a lot of subprime. Secondly, because they've got lots of property and real estate which is worth far less. And thirdly, that they're actually lending to governments. And there's big issues about the lending to Greece and the lending to Ireland and everything else that may yet have to be resolved. So there is a banking problem in Europe. And then there's a growth problem. And the one that is really discussed least is the growth problem, that if Europe cannot start to grow in a faster way, then you're condemning yourself to very high levels of unemployment for the next decade. And you could be talking about the decade from here for 10 years ahead as the lost decade, a wasted decade where large numbers of people remain unemployed. One or two countries in Europe do well, but as a whole, Europe is not able to grow at a level that is both sustainable for employment or for rising prosperity. Now, I'm under no illusion that countries have got big issues to deal with. I mean, Ireland's problem with its banks probably arise from a small number of developers who lent large sums of money, and now the whole of the Irish people are having to pay back for them. Greece's problem is certainly a fiscal problem that arises from their inability to collect tax revenues. But look at Europe as a whole, and there needs to be direction given by the European leaders to the markets that they will first of all deal with the deficit problem in a trajectory which does not imperil growth. Secondly, that they will take head-on the banking problem, which requires a great deal more recapitalization. And thirdly, that they will have a strategy for growth. Now, unless you have these three things, unless you solve the three problems together, and I suggest that the European Council meeting should be designed to show that you're solving these three problems together, then you have exactly the decade that I'm talking about. And I suspect that over time, more people will agree that growth becomes a bigger and bigger problem if we don't get back to it at a level that is essential.
Yep. I've seen one over there in the extreme, yes, and then you. Sorry, have I missed anyone? Yeah, we haven't got very much time. This clock is ticking away. We seem to have 5.5 minutes. So please ask very quick questions.
My question will be brief, Gordon. Anatole Skidelsky of the Times. You were in the government that gave Alan Greenspan a knighthood. And these days, that is a form of guilt by association. Personally, I don't think it should be, and I'd like you to reflect not so much on the personality, but really there were very many similarities between his policies and yours, and there were two aspects. One was financial deregulation, which in hindsight everybody's condemning, and I wonder how you feel about that. The other was the use of monetary policy to promote full employment, to manage demand in a way that had not been done in the 80s and 90s. And personally, I think that was a tremendous achievement of Alan Greenspan and of the Bank of England and your government. These days, both of those are associated and they're both thrown away. I just wonder what your reflections are about the mistakes that were made in the decade up to the crisis.
Well, if I can recommend Anatole's book, because he goes through these issues very carefully, and his criticism is well taken. Look, what happened in the 90s and in the years before 2007? I remember the debate in the 90s and the early years of the 21st century rather differently from you, Anatole. I was under, and Britain was under, relentless pressure from the city that we were over-regulating. When we set up the Financial Services Authority, which was the first attempt to have statutory authority dealing with what was previously done on a non-statutory basis, people felt that Britain was actually leading the way to an over-regulated world. And all throughout these 10 or 15 years, the battle was not whether we had regulated too little. The battle was between people who said we had regulated too much. Now, we know in retrospect what we missed. You see, we set up the Financial Services Authority believing that the problem would come from the failure of an individual institution. So we believed that if you could monitor the economic problem we thought was inflation, and not financial stability, the macro problem. And we thought that the problem about individual financial institutions, we'd had BCCI, we'd had all these other problems about individual financial institutions that were badly run and in some cases exposed as corrupt. So we created a monitoring system which was looking at individual institutions. That was the big mistake. We didn't understand how risk was spread across the system. We didn't understand the entanglements of different institutions with the other. And we didn't understand, even although we talked about it, just how global things were, including a shadow banking system as well as a banking system. And that was our mistake, but I'm afraid it was a mistake made by just about everybody who was in the regulatory business. And we have had to learn, as I said in my opening remarks, we did a simulation exercise and didn't even then realize just how entangled things were. We thought we were dealing with the problems of an individual institution, but the spillover effect, as we found during the crisis, was so big. So it's made people rethink in its entirety the way we do regulation. And I've got to accept my responsibility, and I do, and I've been very open about saying that we made mistakes on that. But in a world where the understanding of what global meant was incomplete, I think many writers, as well as many regulators, made exactly the same mistake. And we've therefore got to learn from it. And that's why I say what I said in 1998. You need a global financial supervisory system. You need it to be the transparent flow of information, and you need proper systems of accountability, and you need cross-border supervision of individual companies. Now, that's the lessons we've learned. I think Alan Greenspan has been honourable in the way that he has admitted his mistake as well. I mean, when he said he was acting as if executives would take responsibility essentially to the public for their actions, and he'd found that this was a flawed conception of how the financial system was working, I think he was pretty honest about the mistakes that he made. So I don't think Alan Greenspan should be penalised as an individual. I think we should all recognise that basically we were seeing a restructuring of the world economy. We didn't quite understand how big it was. We didn't quite understand the implications of everything that was going on. We should have understood better, but let's make sure that in the next few years we don't return to making the same mistakes. And my point to you today is that if we're allowing the search for global financial supervision to be relegated to simply a series of national supervisory initiatives, and if we can't agree on global growth coordination, can't even get a trade deal, then we're already slipping back into a world where there's a global economy, but we're accepting protectionist sentiment will dominate.
Thank you. We've got time for one. Yeah, go on.
Do you want to take two or three and I'll take them together?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, very quick, please. Just one point. Okay.
It's an honor to have this conversation with you as an undergrad, and
thank you very much.
And thank you, INET and Mr. Robert Johnson, to make this opportunity available to us. I wonder, what would you say to the youth in China who is about the age of your children? Would you say to them, what should they do and not do to ensure a peaceful development of China and other developing countries and lead toward a wonder that could be? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take this in a cluster. And two more. Yeah, right at the back. Quick. Sorry. Get the microphone. Can you hear it? Thank you. And over here, there was someone. Yeah, go on.
You said you'd abolish boom and bust, that you'd abolish the business cycle. And you designed your regulatory systems to try to prevent recessions ever occurring again. In terms of the restructuring of international regulation you've been talking about, do you think that's still a legitimate and valid aim? Or should we rather be thinking about the fact that recessions are inherently unpredictable and we should be trying to design structures which give resilience to economies in the face of unpredictable shocks, rather than trying to have regulations which, as you said, abolish boom and bust and try and abolish the business cycle.
Yeah, I would refer you to some of the work that Joe Stiglitz has done on this, that it is possible for us to design institutions in a better way so that the decisions that are made by individual countries become less necessary than they seem. For example, the build-up of world reserves, the lack of an insurance policy at an international level that would protect people against financial crises without them having to amass huge global reserves for their own country. And that's true of most of Asia, but it's also true of other countries as well. So I think that's a big issue, where you look at where you can remove avoidable risk and see what international measures can be taken to do so. I just say on this boom and bust, what I said was that inflation had been Britain's biggest problem, and it was for 50 years. Every time we grew, we had an inflationary cycle, and every time that we tried to deal with it, we had a recession, and Britain had a history of going in and out of recessions as a result of inflationary problems. And what we tried to do by making the Bank of England independent was to keep inflation at as low a level as possible, and to that extent we were taking action to avoid that kind of recession. What of course happened was that we had a financial instability that brought about this recession, and as I'm suggesting to you today, from my, if you like, reflections on what happened, there is still a danger that you will have repeated financial instabilities unless you actually deal with the fundamental problems that we face. I do agree that we should build in environmental sustainability into what we talk about, and I've emphasized the importance of a climate change agreement, and I believe at the moment that the world is depriving itself of a huge industrial growth area in low carbon and renewables, simply because we have not the stability that would come from there being a climate change agreement. And large numbers of people could be in jobs if that climate change agreement was giving people the security that they wanted to make decisions about investment for the future. And just finally, this question, I would urge China to be part of the international community. And I think we're in a fortunate situation where, you know, the Cold War is over and there is no Cold War. But to be half inside and half outside a community is always a problem. And it's really important, I think, that we recognize the common interests that we have together. And I think for China, just like America, to recognize that trade between them is absolutely critical. And for China to recognize that it can increase its consumption, for America to take action that will increase its ability to invest and then produce some of the high value added goods of the future. As for Europe, there is the potential, in my view, for an agreement that is in the interests of all continents. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that while politics has returned to being simply national, that the problems are still global. And so for China's young people, thousands who are coming to universities, for example, in America and Europe, joining and being part of the international community is, in my view, the way for us to build better for the future.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I think we have heard a wonderful exposition by a thinking politician who has not given up his striving for a better world.
Robert, thank you very much. You're very kind.